Sonali, this could be kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it could be a big deal. And if you see Bitcoin prices, certainly the market thinks it is. If you take a look, you have a more than 9% jump in Bitcoin over the last 24 hours. It is still down on the 7-day period, but a significant lift here, more than the other assets. If you flip up the board and take a look at Ethereum, for example, also getting a lift about 6% or so. But the one interesting thing to me is while those assets have gotten a lift, Tether and stablecoins more largely have not seen as much of a lift, are pretty stable on the day, but again, stable on the week as well. So what are the safe havens here? Let's get someone else's take here. We're going to bring in Marty Chavez on this. He is the vice chairman at Sixth Street Partners, really a pioneer when it comes to technology and money. Marty, thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot of criticism about the executive order that came out of the White House. On one hand, it's been hailed as a watershed moment, but on the other hand, it has also been criticized as short on details. What's your take?
Sonali, we've talked about this topic before. I've been saying for a long time, the best thing that could possibly happen to digital regulation, digital assets is the appropriate amount of regulation. Sure, the executive order did not give us a lot of detail. It mostly directed a variety of organizations in the government to do more work and do more study, and that's great. There is, we expect a Treasury paper forthcoming later this year that's going to have a lot more detail. But I would say that at the root of my concerns, and you and I have talked about this before, are really the stable coins, right? The stable coins are a form of currency peg, and currency pegs have not been successful. They work right up until the moment that they don't work. And there's certainly not a lot of detail. I'm not sure there's any in the executive order about stable coins. And to my mind, the appropriate regulation of stable coins, which I would see as a kind of narrow bank, so we actually know what are the assets backing them and what are the mechanisms for those assets. I think that's going to be hugely important. And until we have that, I don't know how investable the whole space of digital assets is from my perspective, but once we have a foundation for the stable coins that looks like narrow banking and appropriate regulation, I think it's going to be a part of an immensely important, long secular trend, the dematerialization of everything.
Marty, what about what we're seeing here in terms of investment into things like the Ukraine DAO, the way that investors have really been able to mobilize and raise money at scale when people have not been able to access currency in the traditional way?
Well, first, let's just start by just acknowledging the pure horror of what's going on in Ukraine, and the sympathy. And the sympathy isn't even the word for the suffering that's happening over there. And to the extent that cryptocurrency can partially mitigate some aspects of that suffering, I think it's huge. It does show you that there's ways to move money internationally with cryptocurrency, which we've all known that are interesting, that don't require intermediaries. Of course, it brings up all kinds of concerns about the enforceability of sanctions, and there's all kinds of discussions about Russian wallets and the exchanges, and that's complicated.
Yeah, I'm really curious about what you think about that and the role that crypto plays here when there are sanctions and really lots of governments around the world trying to restrict the flow of capital. Is crypto going to fix or make that worse?
So, restricting the flow of capital, sanctions. Look, this is something that governments do. Personally, to my mind, we have heard commentators say the U.S. is not playing fair with the dollar. Well, I don't know that playing fair is really what the discussion is about when Russia unprovoked invaded Ukraine. And so cryptocurrencies do provide this mechanism. I think it's important as a matter of sovereignty to have the right amount of regulation. I don't like using the term cryptocurrencies. I don't think they're currencies. I think they're digital assets. The currency is a different thing, and this is something else that I've been saying for a long time. Digitizing the US dollar in an appropriate way that respects identity, privacy, know your client, anti-money laundering, sanctions regimes that bolsters the Fed's tools for macroeconomic policy and the United States' tools for geopolitical policy. That's hard. And getting that right is really important. But to me, it's not an option. Do we want to digitize the US dollar? That dematerialization journey has to continue. It's important for US leadership. It's important as a matter of innovation. And getting it right is extremely
Marty,
hard.
to what
Yes.
extent is it a question of national security? You have millions of people who are flocking to China's central bank digital currency as we speak. And I'm wondering if the U.S. doesn't catch up and do the same, to what extent does that start to shift global financial powers over to China?
I worry about this a lot, Sonali. The dollar status as the global reserve asset is not written in stone. It has persisted for 100 years. Not that the historical pattern needs to repeat, but about every 100 years, there's a different global reserve asset. And I've been saying for a few years now, digitizing the US dollar in an appropriate way, is essential. It's not just another form factor, right? To me, that's like saying a starship and a bicycle are just two different forms of transportation. No big difference between the two, right? A digital dollar, potentially a programmable dollar, is a completely different thing than the inert paper dollar that we currently have. The only two forms of central bank money we have today are the notes and Fed funds in Fed master accounts. Introducing another form that is just like the dollar, but it's digital. We don't need the paper symbolizing it anymore. That's really important, but getting the details right, like the know your client, anti-money laundering, what are the right amounts? Can they be removed? Can you apply sanctions? If so, what's the process? Like designing all of this, it has to be thoughtful,
Marty,
and it's really hard, and it's essential.
we have just about another minute, 30 seconds here. What about the investability of digital assets until we get to that regulatory point that you're talking about? Are you comfortable? Are your clients and rivals comfortable with getting into them?
Now, many clients and rivals are comfortable, but when I am thinking about it from the Sixth Street point of view, it's we see the right amount of regulation as essential. I'll give you an analogy. Before airplanes were regulated and the safety of airplanes were regulated, you were taking your life into your hands every time you got on a commercial flight. And so having all the rules that we currently have about rebuilding the airplanes every so often, how they have to be maintained in the checklists and all, yes, it was expensive and cumbersome to comply with that, but it was game changing. It
Right.
is the condition precedent for the industry to really grow and to be what it needs to be. And so I would say the executive order is a great step along this journey of creating the appropriate regulatory framework. Once we get that right, and we get it right for stablecoins, which are the underpinning
Right.
of the current crypto ecosystem, that's going to be a golden age.